Thank you so much, Anurag, Ruhail, Dr. Velumani. Um, Privileged to be here today. When I asked Ruhail what he wanted me to talk about, he said, whatever you want to, but will you please talk about the future of the event and the experiential business? Last night, I don't know, have any of you been to a place called Shaheen Bagh? Actually been rather than just seen a photograph? Anybody in the room? Okay, you've been. So last night I went to Shaheen Bagh for the first time. Um, for those of you who will go, and I hope some of you will, when you get to the Jamia checkpoint, the police check you, and then you go through that. There's a long traffic line. And then you get to the next checkpoint, which is where the rapid action force checks you. And then you get to the third checkpoint, where a very meticulous group of volunteers from Jamia check every car and every person going through the door. You will look at the art on both sides of the road as you drive towards Shaheen Bagh. I've never been there before. It was my first time. You park, you walk across there, and you get to a very simply erected tent, not a shadi tent as we know in our environment. You start hearing the voices of the people from a distance. And actually, when you get to the place, you start seeing these enormous installations, including the map of India, a new installation that came up yesterday, which was the photographs of some of the women in Shaheen Bagh. And then you get to the tent itself and look at the stage, and there was Shubha Mudgal, and there was Deepak Castellino who followed, and there was Harsh Mandar. And all of it, and there were hundreds of people there, and there was food, there was refreshments being served, there was tea, there was somebody cleaning up, there was a library which is in the bus stop which is called Shaheen Bagh. And in all of that, there's a system. And that system really represents in many ways the event industry. What came home to me last night was that at the end of the day, irrespective of how simple or how complex or how complicated the world that we create is, it's content that's king. And as Dr. Velumani said, and Sanjeev and Anil and were talking about that, it's finally about the content. And that content was presented so simply, and yet the kind of spirit that you saw there was incredible. It certainly blew me away, and it changed my perception of what that place was. In the events and experiential industry, what is it that governs us, and what is it that we need to look at into the future? I think that's the big question that needs to be addressed in the room. Yes, weddings are getting much more sophisticated. Corporate events are getting much more into ROI. What is it that that event can deliver for that corporate client or for the brand? And underlining all of that is really the future. What is it that we can sell? What is that story that we can tell, as Dr. Velumani said? What is that story that binds people together, that makes you a community, that makes you stand together and fight for something, for a belief, irrespective of which side of the political divide you're on? And that belief today will continue to change. But the world is changing. The world has lurched to the right. And those of us who were on the other side of history find ourselves particularly constrained right now, but that's okay. That's how history goes. Technology is the big driver, as we've seen. I'll give you an example of what happened in the Jaipur Literature Festival this year. We had a group of people coming from Germany, and they set up a virtual reality space to tell a story. As Dr. Velumani is saying, stories are important. So you walked into that space, you wore your virtual reality headgear, and it was a room that you entered in your virtual space. And then you started exploring. I tried to open the window, I couldn't open the window. I tried to open a cupboard, I couldn't open it. I tried to open the door opened and allowed me into another space, somewhat like gaming. And that space led to, another series of activities which allowed you into another space where finally at the end of this corridor or this room was a mirror. And when you looked into the mirror, you realized that what you had been transformed into through this process was Kafka's metamorphosis. You were an insect or a bug. In the telling of the story of using technology to tell a tale that's timeless, the metamorphosis of a human being into a bug, what is it that these people did? They basically made you the centerpiece, pretty much like what Anil was saying, in the journey to discover whatever you wanted to discover. So, where does technology then, what is the role that technology will play going into the future, whether it's for companies, corporations, or for us in the events and experiential space? You could very well have a virtual wedding today. You could have a green wall. You could create Versailles without necessarily spending millions of dollars of getting there. You could also virtually create a bride, but let's not go down that particular route. And you can create an experience which will be interesting, which you can post on social media, which you can get your friends to be part of without necessarily moving an inch from wherever you are. Is that the future? Well, that could well be the future. If you look at the wedding industry, which for a long time, most people in the corporate world foo-fooed, saying that, this is the business of families. Today, the wedding industry is primarily the one that's galloping away at about 110% growth a year. And the kind of market possibilities that's throwing up across the world is huge. Every country, Turkey, Egypt, across Europe, Thailand, Malaysia, China, Australia, is beating their way a path to India to be able to capture a piece of that wedding industry. And yet, to some extent, our people driving that industry are still unaware of the wealth and the leverage that rests there. And what is it that you can do? Corporates today look at the wedding of their progeny, of their kids, as a corporate statement. The Reliance wedding farmed out the wedding across their company groups. Every company had a responsibility, every company contributed to that wedding, every company brought in their key partners to the table to be able to make a brand pitch. Corporate events and weddings are going to get more and more intertwined and joined at the hip, because it's a place where you don't necessarily have to restrict your imagination. You create the story with a happy ending, which is the wedding story. Prince meets princess, they get happily married, they drive into the sunset. If you now look at that as an analogy of success, and look at the way that corporates today look at how they do an event, what is it that they want to do? They do a sales event, they do a marketing event, they do a brand event, they do a brand extension event. And at each point of time, it comes back to them wanting to tell a unique story. Not just any story, but a unique story. And unless you are able to define that uniqueness of the story, you're not going to be able to capture the imagination of these people. In telling the unique story, this industry will see a seismic change. I don't think that the industry is quite ready for it yet, but it will. Because that unique story will have 2 or 3 things involved in it. It will continue to look at furthering technology, but it will harness that technology to make it their own, which is in that particular Indian way which combines hospitality, which combines a touchy-touchy, feely-feely kind of context, and it combines our tradition and culture. Coming into this room at the Taj Vivanta, we could be in any room anywhere in the world, right? It doesn't have one trace of India in it, not one. Will it be a unique space ever? No. It's a ballroom. Would you, if given an opportunity of a red fort transported into the middle of the city, accessible, etc., prefer to go there, or a nameless, faceless room where you can do a couple of screens and a stage? You have to create context. You have to create the environment. When we do something at Amer Fort in Jaipur, at the back of the Jaipur Literature Festival, half the battle is won of wowing our Nobel laureates or our people who are coming from across the world, or Ken Juster or the minister from Abu Dhabi, because of the setting, because it's not in a space which is neutral. You have to move out of neutral spaces. Every corporate has to look at that challenge of how they are going to define their space, which is not neutral. Because neutral is the rest of the ecosystem. So what is it that you can do to be able to move beyond? So you harness technology, harness tradition and culture, and essentially harness creativity and the ability to tell your story most effectively. If Dr. Velumani hadn't opened this morning, we wouldn't have known the power of no. He has used the power of no, for example, as has Anil, extremely effectively to bring people, as he said, to the table on your terms. If many of you here are from the event and experiential space as opposed to the corporate space, you will know that the crux in any relationship with your corporate client is that of the relationship. If the client feels that you are supine and don't have an idea in your head, he will give you 200 ideas and expect that to be constructed in the way that he has designed it. Not necessarily because it's the best thing to do, but because he just thinks that he knows better than you. Whereas if you go into the room with that power and the experience and the responsibility and the prestige and that unique selling point that you can make a difference for him and his brand and add value, you will get a completely different sense of how you're received at his table. In being received at the table, again, you come back to the fundamentals is, what is that partnership that you're trying to create? What is the partnership that Dr. Velumani tried to create with the folks who came back the second and third and fourth time with their checkbook? He created a partnership of value. Value has to be realized. Value is not necessarily something in that virtual space that you'll put down on a PowerPoint presentation to impress your client. If you're able to show the client value through innovation, using technology, creativity, and the fundamentals of culture and tradition, you're creating a value proposition which is priceless. Anil today can walk into a sponsor's a place and command a price, I hope, because he's created a value proposition. Similarly, those of you who deliver something for your corporate clients or for your IP, if you're able to have that track record where you've shown that you've created value, forget the ROIs and so on and so forth, just created value, you will get huge traction. The future of our industry also has to depend on how responsible each of us are as citizens. For far too long have we ignored the needs of the planet. For far too long have we ignored the needs of our neighbors. For far too long have we ignored the needs of those people who don't have what we have. When you disempower and disenfranchise a whole community, you're kicking yourself in the shin because you're stopping them from being part of your economic growth. When you remove a particular group of people and say they're too poor and therefore we are not going to address them, you're immediately saying that I am restricting what I'm going to sell, not today, but in the future. In India's middle class growth, we have seen year on year an incredible upward swing of economic and social mobility. And that's creating the people who run in Anil's marathons, people who buy into Dr. Velumani's products, or those who come to Sanjeev and say, this is what I want to reach out to. What is our responsibility as people who weave stories together, collectively? Our responsibilities is to ensure that the degree of inequity that we see, we try and address in some way. Whether it's through creation of jobs, whether it's through better services that we give our colleagues, better education, better training, creating an ecosystem, as Anil talked about, when you create an IP in the furthest of places, whether it's a Hubli or a Cuttack or a Kalinga University or a Jaisalmer or a Jodhpur or wherever, we have to create those ecosystems. That 1 million jobs a month ain't happening in the way the economy is going, and certainly not happening in the way that the finance minister has laid out the next budget for 2020. Those jobs will only happen if each of us as entrepreneurs and creators of wealth take a responsibility and say that we will create 5 or 10 jobs by doing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which will help us. The other responsibility we have, as I said, is to the planet. I see that there's glass water bottles here. In removing plastic, we also have to be aware of what is it that we're doing. Was there enough notice to plastic manufacturers to be able to skill upgrade? Have we put out a whole set of people from their jobs? How much of the carbon footprint is added by creating glass bottles? What is the amount of carbon footprint by transporting glass bottles that are heavier? Yes, we all work very emotively, collectively. So when they say no straws, we remove the straws. No plastic bottles, we remove the plastic bottles. But do we question? Each of you, I'm assuming, in this room are managers, are entrepreneurs, and heads of your organization. What is your responsibility? Your first and primary responsibility is to question. Not necessarily only on Google, but question each other, question your client, question your colleagues, question your service providers, question so that you can do a job better. So you can make that difference. You can build a system which is more efficient, saves you and your client money, is able to create wealth. If you're going to be the robots that we see in George Orwell's 1984, you shouldn't be in this room. Business world shouldn't be doing this conference. Conferences and networking opportunities are to question, are to push back. It may be the most foolish question in the world. Ask it. And in asking it, you probably will get the answer in your question. But don't be blind. Don't be blind to the world out there. Look at the Iowa caucus or the Iowa primaries that happened yesterday. The Democrats who've been working for the last 2 years to be able to drive, or 3 years to be able to drive Trump out of office after their failed effort with Hillary Clinton, didn't ask the question as to who built the app that was going to count the votes. Didn't ask the question whether there would be enough bandwidth where the app was being used. And you have a fiasco which will derail the democratic process towards this next election. Why? They forgot to ask a question. They assumed, as each one of us in this room do, that somebody has thought it through. Somebody has taken responsibility. Somebody else has done whatever you think that they should have done. But we know in the world of crises, and each one of us deal with a crisis every second, that that's not true. So if you don't ask that question, you're in deep shit. And there's no other word for it. And it's easy for you to pass the buck on and say, I didn't know, and he or she should have known, and I should have asked the question, but it's his responsibility or her responsibility. No. You are the owner, the manager, the head of business. It's your responsibility to ask the question. Sometimes simple ones, like who built the app. Sometimes more difficult ones, who designed this venue. But ask it, because without that, there will be no progress. Without that, society can't progress. Without that, we will not evolve. Finally, we evolve a fish in the year whatever. Many billions of years ago, we were all fish. We've all evolved from fish. And for those of you who don't know, please read a book called Indica, Earth Beneath Your Feet by Pranay Lal to see how we got where we are and the fact that India was attached to Antarctica and Africa and blah, 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 till we found our way here. But in that asking the question, we have to continue to evolve. The event and experiential industry is at an impasse because we're all trying to do Me Too kind of things, not in the movement kind of way, but in the Kaun Banega Crorepati kind of way. You've done 1 crore Banega Crorepati, it's successful, so we'll do 20 crore Kaun Banega Crorepatis. You've done 1 successful marathon, so every village, every town, every whatever will try and do a marathon without the learning, without the evolution, without the USP. Each of his marathons, each of them has a USP. Each of them is different. Each of our festivals, 33 of them across the world, has a USP. None of them are similar. Each JLF internationally has a USP, which is the reason why they're successful. You can only be as successful as the new idea that you have. If you're going to spin out the same presentation, cut and paste to Government of India, Maruti, Ford, whatever, BMW, Morris, whoever, you ain't getting the business, folks. You're dead in the water. You're not going to be able to sell the same soap in the way that you've done for the last 10 years, I promise you. Things have moved on. The world has changed. People have changed. Young people have changed. They are the future. All of us, with hair or without hair, our time is over. So if you really want change, empower the young people in your company, give them a free hand, let them go out and come up with those 10 big ideas or new ideas, whether it's for a corporate presentation, otherwise, choose one of them and invest in failure. Failure is super important. Why? Because you can learn from it. If every one of us was successful, the world would be a different place, but it isn't. If there was a formula for films being a super hit one after the other, everybody would have found that science and done a successful film, but it doesn't work like that. You have to learn. You have to learn from failure. And that learning is incredible and huge and absolutely priceless. So rather than castigating the guy who comes into your room next time and saying, you have done this and you have failed, ask him or her what they've learned from what they've done. And put that into your process system. and learn from them. And in learning, you will move on. In learning, you will progress. So to conclude, please look beyond your nose, look towards building equity, ask the questions, protect the planet, take responsibility, and speak up. Of all things today in the world, irrespective of who you are or what you do, if you are silent in the face of all that you see around you, whether it's in Syria or Libya or Lucknow or Timbuktu or wherever, you are complicit in the destruction and murder of a human being. And it doesn't matter whether that human being is black, brown, pink, or purple. It doesn't matter whether he's of this religion or that religion. He, like you, are connected. Collectively, we can make a better world, however bizarre that may sound. Please, each of us have a responsibility to ourselves and our future, our children, and the planet. Thank you.